In the early days of human civilization, before cities rose from the dust and before kings sat upon golden thrones, there was the valley. A stretch of fertile land nestled between two mountain ranges, divided by a wide and winding river. This valley would one day be called the Cradle of Peace, though few remember why. To the west lay the kingdom of Almar. Its people were builders, farmers, and scholars. They believed in balance between man and nature, between the sword and the plow. Their cities were modest, but strong, made of stone shaped by hand and bound by knowledge passed down from elder to child. To the east stood the empire of Dravik. Larger, richer, more militarized. Dravik's emperors believed in expansion, in control, and in strength. Their soldiers trained from youth. Their forges burned day and night. Their cities were walled fortresses, towering monuments to order and command. Between them flowed the river Diran, wide and deep. For centuries, it marked the boundary, not just of land, but of philosophy. On its western banks, the rhythm of life moved with the seasons. On the east, life marched with discipline, precision, and ambition. But rivers can carry more than water. They carry stories, secrets, and sometimes the first signs of discord. The valley was blessed. Rainfall fed the crop. Fish filled the rivers. Game roamed the forest. Both Almar and Dravik prospered. The people traded across the river, food for tools, livestock for iron. There was tension, yes, as with all neighbors, but it was managed. Respected. A treaty bound them, signed by rulers, watched by priests, and witnessed by the gods, or so the legends say. The treaty was simple. Neither kingdom would cross the river with arms. The Diran would remain neutral, sacred. A symbol of shared prosperity. The treaty lasted for nearly 100 years. Then came the drought. For 3 years the rains failed. The sun blazed hotter. Crops withered. Rivers shrank. The mighty Diran ran slower, narrower. Fish died. Wells dried. Hunger, once a stranger in the valley, now made a home in every village. Both Almar and Dravik suffered. But Almar, with its smaller population and more sustainable methods, endured. Dravik, dependent on vast harvests and rigid supply chains, teetered on collapse. Food riots broke out in its eastern provinces. Soldiers were deployed to guard granaries. Rumors spread that the emperor might invade Almar, just to feed his people. The leaders of Almar and Dravik met at the stone bridge over the Diran. They spoke of cooperation, of trade and patience. Almar offered grain in exchange for metals and craftsmen. Dravik accepted, but resentment lingered. The leaders were King Mehran of Almar and Emperor Varkal of Dravik. Mehran was known for his steady hand and calm mind. He ruled from the city of Renar, surrounded by wise counselors and a devoted populace. Varkal, on the other hand, ruled from the iron citadel of Chronos, a cold and unyielding place built into the mountains. He was proud, severe, and suspicious of all but his most loyal generals. At the meeting, King Mehran brought his son, Prince Elric, a young man of 23 summers, intelligent, curious, and passionate about peace. Emperor Varkal brought his eldest daughter, General Kedra, battle-hardened, unflinching, and skeptical of Almar's intentions. Despite efforts, the meeting ended coldly. Kedra warned her father, "They pity us. They believe we are weakened. We must act first." Elric pleaded with Mehran, "There is still time to stop this." Then, one night, a Dravik grain caravan bound for the capital vanished. Days later, the burned-out wagons were found in a ravine. Every guard had been killed. Their bodies mutilated, their tongues removed, a sign, some believed, of a warning. The Emperor of Dravik was enraged. He accused Almar of sabotage, of betrayal. Almar denied it, claiming perhaps the eastern hill tribes had attacked. But the Emperor saw weakness in their denial. Or perhaps he saw opportunity. A message was sent. If Almar did not turn over the culprits within 3 days, Dravik would consider the treaty broken. Almar searched. They found no evidence. No guilty party. No tracks, no clues. But the deadline loomed. On the 4th day, as the sun rose red over the river, Dravik declared the treaty void. Troops began to mass on the eastern banks of the Diran. Almar responded in kind. Farmers laid down plows and picked up spears. Blacksmiths worked day and night, turning iron into blades. Scouts were sent. Messengers galloped between villages and forts. Still there was hope. Diplomats traveled. Priests prayed. The river still flowed. But beneath it all, something had changed. Prince Elric led a final delegation to Chronos. He begged the emperor to reconsider. Varkle listened but did not speak. Kedra watched from the shadows. When Elric returned, he knew the decision had already been made. Then came the final spark. A skirmish near a border town. Confusion. An arrow loosed in panic. A soldier killed. Retaliation followed. One battle led to another. Soon, the river ran not with water, but with blood. The valley, once a place of balance and bounty, became a battlefield. The trees that once bore fruit now burned. The roads once traveled by merchants now carried wounded and dead. The first year of war saw little gain, only loss. Villages vanished. Fields went untended. Children cried for fathers who would never return. A bard in Almar sang a haunting verse. Once the river gave us bread. Now it swallows up our dead. Iron sings and wood is flame. But none remember who's to blame. They built. They trained. They planned. The war was no longer about grain or vengeance. It had become something greater, a struggle for dominance. A test of survival. The river that once united now divided. And neither side would rest until it was theirs. Thus began the ancient war, born of hunger, ignited by pride, and destined to consume all who lived in the valley. And this was only the beginning. The spring after the treaty was broken brought not the renewal of life, but the advance of war. The river Diran, once a symbol of balance and promise, had shrunk to a shallow, meandering scar. Where once its waters flowed deep and wide, now the rocky bed showed in patches. It was no longer a barrier. It was no longer protection. It had become a path. It was along this path that the first real armies moved. The Empire of Dravik struck first. They did not send a full force across the river at once. They were too disciplined for that. Instead, they tested. 100 men, scouts and raiders, crossed near the town of Meneth Ford, where the river narrowed between two cliffs. They moved at night. Silent, precise, trained for speed, not occupation. They struck the outposts with fire and steel. 3 Almari watchtowers fell before the kingdom could muster a response. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Dravik soldiers were already gone, back across the Diran, dragging spoils behind them and leaving behind only ashes and fear. Word spread fast. In Renar, King Mehran called a war council. His face was pale, his voice quieter than usual. The weight of leadership had begun to bear down on him. He listened more than he spoke. Generals argued. Nobles made demands. Some called for retaliation. Others for walls and watchfires. Prince Elric stood before them and spoke with a calm voice. If we strike blindly, we become no better than they. But if we do not act, they will see us as cowards. We must defend, but wisely. We must protect our people, not our pride. And so, Almar's forces were reorganized. Garrisons along the eastern frontier were reinforced. Scouts and messengers were placed at every crossing. Riverboats were repurposed for patrols. Civilians from vulnerable villages were evacuated inland. But war has a way of ignoring plans. 2 weeks later, a much larger Dravik force, over 2,000 strong, crossed the Diran under cover of storm clouds and fog. They struck the town of Farrell's Bend, a fortified trade outpost along the southern bend of the river. Farrell's Bend had high walls and loyal soldiers, but they were not ready. The Dravik army came with siege engines, mobile ballistae and a great battering ram known as the Hammer of Varkle. General Kedra herself led the assault. Her banner, a black eagle on red, flew high from the front. The battle lasted for 3 days. On the first, the outer wall was breached. On the second, the town center fell. On the third, the last defenders made their stand in the granary, fighting with pitchforks, broken swords, and bare hands. When it was over, Farrell's Bend was ash and ruin. Hundreds lay dead. Hundreds more were taken captive. And the river, that once peaceful ribbon through the valley, now had its first true casualty. Elric arrived a day later, too late to save it. He stood amid the ruins, his cloak soaked with rain and soot. He found a broken toy lying beside a shattered hearth, a child's carved wooden horse, blackened by fire. He did not speak for a long time. At that moment the prince changed. Before Farrell's Bend, Elric had clung to hope, the belief that reason might win. That if he could speak the right words, peace might still be saved. But fire and death had silenced words. From then on, Elric trained not as a diplomat, but as a commander. He drilled daily with sword and bow. He studied tactics. He rode to each outpost along the river, learning the land with his own eyes. Soldiers who had once seen him as a noble dreamer now followed him with respect. They called him the River Hawk, for he watched the Diran like a bird of prey, sharp-eyed and unblinking. But the enemy watched too. In Dravik, General Kidra returned to the Iron Citadel to thunderous praise. The people hailed her as a hero. Songs were sung of the victory. Children were named after her. Yet she did not celebrate. She knew Farrell's Bend was only the beginning. She had seen the stubbornness in the eyes of the Almari. She knew they would not yield easily. And Kidra respected her enemy, especially Elric. She had met him only twice, but each time she sensed something unusual. Not weakness, but conviction. Not softness, but strength held in reserve. And she feared that such a man, if pushed too far, could become something dangerous. Still, the orders came. Emperor Varkal was pleased with the result and demanded more. He wanted control of the entire riverbank before the year's end. 3 more legions were sent to support Kidra's command. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly in the mountain forges. A new siege engine, larger than the last, was under construction, named the Fist. But Kidra knew the cost of speed. The river teaches patience, she told her officers. We cannot control it with force alone. Some disagreed. One young general, Darnex, eager for glory, dismissed her caution. They are scattered, frightened. Now is the time to strike hard and break their will. Kidra did not argue. She simply allowed Darnex to lead the next raid, a bold push across the river to take the hilltop fortress of Solanwatch. It was a mistake. Solanwatch was not as weak as it appeared. The Almari had reinforced it secretly, led by Elric himself. When the Dravik forces arrived, expecting light resistance, they walked into a trap. Almari archers waited in silence behind hidden ridges. Just as the Dravik vanguard crossed the river's shallows, the order was given. Flaming arrows fell like rain. Then came the cavalry, silent riders hidden in the woods, charging from both flanks. Darnex's army broke within hours. Many drowned in the river as they fled. The survivors who reached the other side were few, and most bore scars they would carry for life. Kidra received word of the defeat that evening. She said nothing at first. Then, quietly, she gave an order. Darnex is not to return to command. Across the river, the people of Almar rejoiced. It was their first true victory. Elric's name was sung in the marketplaces. Children played with wooden swords, pretending to be the Riverhawk. But Elric himself did not rejoice. He knew what was coming. For every victory there would be retaliation. For every town saved, another would burn. He had seen the faces of his enemies as they fell. Young men, some not much older than himself, some still boys. He began to write letters to the families of the fallen. Not just the nobles but the common folk. Mothers, brothers, wives. Each letter took him an hour. Sometimes more. He wrote them in ink and in grief. One night, as he sat at his desk, his cousin and closest friend, Idrin, entered. You cannot carry all of it, Elric, he said softly. You are not the river. Elric looked up, his eyes tired. I am not trying to carry the river, he said. Only to stop it from flooding. But it was already flooding. That summer, the war escalated. Kidra, now more cautious but also more ruthless, launched a full campaign along the southern valley. 3 towns fell in quick succession. Almari forces, stretched thin, could not defend every front. The valley's roads, once lifelines of trade, became battlegrounds. Mercenaries appeared, some loyal to neither crown, fighting for coin. Raiders and opportunists prowled the hills. The eastern hill tribes, once neutral, began attacking Almari supply lines, blaming them for the drought. Worse still, the weather did not break. The drought continued. Crops failed again. Wells dried. Refugees flooded the inner cities. Disease crept into crowded camp. The valley, once green and bountiful, now cracked under the weight of war and fire. And still, the river ran slower, redder. In Kravos, Emperor Varkal held a feast to celebrate the southern campaign. But Kidra did not attend. She remained at the front, sleeping in a tent beside her soldiers. In Renar, King Mehron grew weaker. His health faded with each season. He could no longer ride, no longer speak for long. But he watched with pride as his son took on more leadership. Elric began to command not just soldiers, but the people. He organized grain stores, built shelters, arranged treaties with border clans. He was becoming not just a general, but a ruler. And the people followed him. For even as war darkened the valley, hope began to kindle. Not hope for peace, that dream was buried now, but hope that one side might survive. That Almar might yet endure. And as autumn fell across the river valley, with its orange leaves and cold winds, two armies stared across the narrowing waters. The Dravic forces, disciplined and many, waited with siege engines and steel. The Almari, outnumbered but determined, waited with arrows and will. The second year of the war was ending. But the real war, the great war, the one sung of by bards and whispered by grandmothers long after, was only just beginning. And the river, that ancient river, would remember every drop of blood it had swallowed. The war that began on the river's edge had begun to stretch its limbs. Like a storm rolling across the land, it moved beyond the valley, over hills, through forests, and into mountains where few had dared bring armies before. To the west of Almar, beyond the low plains and into the rugged frontier, lay the realm of Varn, a cold, mountainous region carved with stone roads and strongholds built into the cliff. Its people were miners, smiths, and mountain soldiers hardened by snow and silence. They had never been ruled by any crown, but they had fought alongside Almar in past centuries, old friends, forged in survival. Their stronghold, Kar Valn, stood atop a plateau surrounded by peaks that pierced the clouds. Snow drifted year-round in the upper passes. The Varnish people didn't build cities, they built fortresses. Their homes were narrow, their streets steep, and their hearts unyielding. They watched the war from afar, until the smoke crossed the ridgelines. Refugees from southern Almar had begun to flee westward, hoping for shelter beyond the mountain shadows. Among them were children, farmers, even injured soldiers. And with them came stories of Dravic siege engines that cracked city walls, of Kedra's iron discipline, of villages lost in a single night. High Chancellor Urin of Varn, the mountain realm's most powerful voice, summoned his warband leaders. The gray-haired veteran listened to the reports with a stone face. Then he lit a candle, a tradition in Varn that signaled deliberation was over and a decision made. "War is at our doorstep," Urin said. "We can choose when to fight, not whether to fight." Prince Elric of Almar arrived days later. He had crossed the White Elk Pass in the dead of winter with only 20 riders. Many doubted he would survive. But he did, frostbitten, exhausted, but alive. It earned him the respect of the Varnish elders before he even spoke a word. His plea was brief. "We do not come with silver," he said, "but with fire behind us. If Almar burns, the mountains will not hold." Chancellor Urin stood from his stone seat. "Then we will not wait to be burned. Varn marches with Almar." And with that, the mountain gates were opened. The warriors of Varn were not like those from the plains. They did not fight in rows or lines. They fought from ledges and shadows. They moved through ravines. They used rope, avalanche, and silence. And when they struck without mercy. 5,000 marched under the banner of the White Ram, Varn's symbol of endurance and fury. Each soldier wore thick lamellar armor and carried a curved ice-forged axe. They traveled in silence, blending with the rock and snow. Their arrival in Almar was not grand. There was no parade. But for the people, it was hope made flesh. Hardened men and women from a land of hardship, come to fight not for gold, but for survival. General Edrin, Elric's cousin, rode to meet them. "You're late," he joked. The Varnish commander, a woman named Thera of Valn, smiled beneath her bare fur cloak. "Early, by mountain time." They embraced, laughed, and then turned to the east, where the battle awaited. Meanwhile, in the east, Dravic had grown overconfident. Emperor Varkal had received word of Farrell's Bend, Solenwatch, and the southern conquests. His advisors whispered that Almar would soon collapse. He believed them. But General Kedra did not. She had seen what Prince Elric was becoming. She had studied his movements, his ambushes, and his patience. He was not fighting for quick victories, he was drawing them into a longer war. Kedra sent word to the Emperor. "We must not stretch too far. The deeper we go, the harder it will be to hold." But Varkal ignored her warning. "Crush them quickly," he replied. "Send a message." And so, a new force was dispatched, 10,000 strong, to march westward toward the mountain border, to take the city of Delarn, Almar's final bastion before the Varnish frontier. They never reached it. In the canyons south of Delarn, the Varnish army waited. They had spent weeks preparing the ground, rigging boulders, digging deadfalls, laying silent traps. They watched the Dravic army approach, a great black line of soldiers in steel, banners whipping in the wind. At dawn, they struck. The cliffs came alive with arrows and fire. Stones rained from the ridges. The Dravic vanguard faltered. Then, from the fog, the Varnish charged. Axes flashed. Horns blared. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. By nightfall, only half of the Dravic force remained. The rest were buried under rubble, drowned in gorges, or burned in their own wagons. A message was carved into a fallen Dravic shield, and sent back across the river. The mountains do not kneel. The news reached Kidra like thunder. She rode to the ruins herself and surveyed the field. Among the dead, she found a fallen Varnish fighter, barely 16 years old, still clutching her axe. Kidra kneeled beside her and placed a stone on her chest, a Dravic burial gesture of respect. She knew now, this war would not end quickly. Nor would it end cleanly. Kidra began pulling troops back, fortifying what ground they still held. She ordered new supply lines and summoned her best scouts. If Varn was in the war, they would have to be watched constantly. But as Dravic dug in, Almar grew bolder. With Varn at their side, Almar retook 2 river towns and secured the pass into the western valley. The people who had fled now returned. Farmers resumed planting, even if only barley and root vegetables. Markets reopened under guard. And the people began to believe. They believed not that victory was near, but that survival was possible. And then came the coldest winter in a century. Snow blanketed the valley. The river Diran froze in sections. Entire herds of livestock perished. Even the mountain-born Varnish struggled. In Renar, wood became more valuable than gold. King Mehron, frail and bedridden, gave his final orders by candlelight. He called Elric to his side and whispered, "Do not become me. Be better." The next morning, the king died. Elric did not crown himself. He refused ceremony. Instead, he rode to the river and stood upon the ice, where 2 years earlier, he had stood to plead for peace. Now there was only war. But he made a promise that day before soldiers, peasants, and elders. "We fight not for conquest. We fight for each other, for every child who fled, for every home burned. And we will not yield, not today, not ever." The crowd was silent. Then, slowly, a chant began. "Elric, Elric, Elric." He did not smile. He simply turned and returned to the field. There was still work to do. Far away, in the iron citadel of Dravic, Emperor Varkal sat in silence. For the first time, he did not speak at the war council. He listened. His generals argued, some called for escalation, others for retreat. Kidra, when asked, said only, "Almar will not break. Not with Varn at its back." Varkal's eyes narrowed. And then he said the words that would change the course of the war. "Then we must find new allies of our own." And so, messengers were sent, to the eastern tribes, to the desert kings, and to darker places spoken of only in whispers. The war was growing again. Fire had spread beyond the mountains. And the storm had not yet reached its peak. While the mountains rumbled in the west and the river valley drowned in frost, the war reached farther than any had expected. Beyond the great eastern hills, where the land turned to dust and the sky to fire, there lay the realm of Kemtar, the kingdom of sand, sun, and silence. Few from Almar or Dravic had ever seen it. It was a place whispered about in old tales, of gold-covered temples, priests who spoke with the dead, and a god-king who never showed his face. The people of Kemtar lived not by seasons, but by stars. They measured time by the rise of constellations and kept records in carved stone and bone. They had not known war in 100 years. But war, once unleashed, is like smoke, it slips through cracks, carried by wind and rumor. And soon, it arrived in Kemtar. Dravic spies, men skilled in languages and lies, crossed the dry valleys and wind-carved plateaus. They did not enter the cities directly. They found the nomads, the dune tribes who roamed the fringes of the great kingdom, and they spoke of opportunity. "The mountains burn. The river bleeds," they said. "The world shifts. Kemtar can shape it." At first, the nomads laughed. They cared little for river politics or mountain steel. But one among them listened, a younger chieftain named Erwin, son of Shemtan. He had traveled far and seen cities beyond the dunes. And he had ambition. He rode to the edge of the Sun Palace, where the high priests of Kemtar ruled in the name of the God King. The God King had no name, only titles: the Eternal Flame, the Speaker of the Sun, the Sleeper beneath stone. No one had seen his face in over 40 years. Erwin did not ask to see him. Instead, he spoke to the high priest, Nariman, an ancient figure with skin like dry parchment and a voice like a whisper through reeds. "I bring fire from beyond the mountains," Erwin said. The great powers rise. If we do not choose, the choice will be made for us. Nariman listened. He sent his dreams to the temple seers. For 7 days and nights, they watched the stars, read the bones, and listened to the silence beneath the earth. Then they brought forth a single scroll, ancient, sealed with black wax. It was called the Scroll of Ashes. It had been written generations ago, locked away, forgotten. It spoke of a war of 5 fires, of a river soaked in blood, of a throne rising not from gold, but from dust, and of a shadow with no name. Nariman brought the scroll before the sacred flame, and it did not burn. This was taken as a sign. And so Kemtar entered the war. Not as a conqueror, not as a servant, but as prophecy. The armies of Kemtar did not march as other nations did. They rode across the desert like phantoms, in loose formations, on fast horses and sand skiff. They carried curved swords and poison darts. Their armor was light, adorned with solar emblems and ancient glyphs. They were not loud. They were not many. But they were terrifying. They struck the eastern hill tribes first, the same tribes that had harassed Almoran's supply lines. In a single night, 3 hill forts fell. Their warbands were scattered. No one saw them coming. No one saw them leave. Dravik, surprised by the sudden effectiveness, sent an envoy to Kemtar. A golden-chested diplomat named Meradvek. He arrived at the Sun Palace with gifts, praises, and letters bearing Emperor Varkal's seal. He was made to wait 7 days before being seen. When he was finally granted audience, it was not with the God King, but with Nariman. The high priest listened to Vek's pitch. Help Dravik end this war quickly. Take the eastern flank. In return, you will have gold, salt, and tribute. Nariman nodded politely, then asked, Do you know what lies beneath your mountains? Vex was confused. A throne, Nariman continued. Buried. Waiting. And do you know what it says? No, Vex replied. It says, He who rules the river must pass through fire. And then he dismissed the envoy. Kemtar did not ally with Dravik. Nor did they join Almar. They moved on their own. They built no camps. They held no land. They simply struck where they pleased, and always where it hurt most. They destroyed Dravik's supply wagons with fire arrows from 100 paces. They poisoned wells near temporary camp. They laid traps in the sands that could snap a horse's leg like a twig. Kedra received reports of these mysterious forces with growing concern. We cannot fight ghosts, one of her captains complained. Then stop marching like you're in a parade. Meanwhile, in Almar, Elric received word of Kemtar's movements. At first, he feared a new front. But soon, he realized something deeper. They're not here to win land, he said. They're here to witness. To witness what, he did not yet know. But he respected their power. And so, he sent a messenger. Not a noble, not a soldier. A scribe. A girl named Lysar, trained in histories and languages, barely 17. She carried no sword, only scrolls. She crossed the desert with a trade caravan and found her way to the edge of the Sun Palace. There, she waited 3 weeks. When she was finally granted an audience, Nariman did not speak. He handed her a single sheet of barkcloth, inscribed with symbols she had never seen. She returned it to Elric, who showed it to the oldest scholars in Renar. They deciphered only one phrase: the third fire has awakened. Back in Dravik, Emperor Varkal grew impatient. He ordered Kedra to take the eastern ridge by force and cut through the desert paths. Bury the flame in sand, he said. Kedra obeyed, but with hesitation. Her forces moved into the high dunes, where wind screamed and heat shimmered like spirits. They built watchtowers and supply depots. But every step forward was met with silence and then with death. One night, an entire battalion vanished. Only a single scout returned, blind from smoke, his skin marked with strange black sigils. They came from the earth, he said. They rose with the wind. Kedra had seen much in her life. But she now feared what could not be reasoned with. She sent word back to the emperor. We must not chase fire in the dark. Varkal did not respond. As the 3rd year of war began, Kemtar remained an enigma. They had claimed no land. They had spoken no alliances. And yet, their presence changed the shape of every battle. They were the whisper that made soldiers look over their shoulders. The shadow that turned victories into stalemate. The fire that never flickered, even in wind. And somewhere deep beneath the sand, in a temple unseen by outsiders, the God King stirred. He had not spoken in decades. But now, as the stars shifted and the constellations moved, he opened his eyes. The war had awoken more than nations. It had awoken something ancient, and the fourth fire had yet to rise. High atop the cliffs where the valley narrowed into a dead end of stone and sky, the fortress of Greyhold stood silent and tall. Built generations ago by the ancestors of Almar, it was the kingdom's last and greatest wall, a place of refuge, of defense, of sacrifice. It had never fallen. Not to raiders, not to rebels, not even to time. But now, Greyhold stood directly in the path of the largest army ever assembled by the Empire of Dravik. 10,000 strong. Siege engines, war wagons, and a month's worth of supplies. Kedra marched at the head of the column, her black and red banner flapping in the cold wind. This was not a raid. This was not a test. This was a reckoning. And Greyhold, the bastion of Almar, would be tested as never before. High atop the cliffs where the valley narrowed into a dead end of stone and sky, the fortress of Greyhold stood silent and tall. Built generations ago by the ancestors of Almar, it was the kingdom's last and greatest wall, a place of refuge, of defense, of sacrifice. It had never fallen. Not to raiders, not to rebels, not even to time. But now, Greyhold stood directly in the path of the largest army ever assembled by the Empire of Dravik. 10,000 strong. Siege engines, war wagons, and a month's worth of supplies. Kedra marched at the head of the column, her black and red banner flapping in the cold wind. This was not a raid. This was not a test. This was a reckoning. Greyhold was carved directly into the cliffs of the Western Pass, its lower walls made of black mountain stone, its upper halls hidden within the rock itself. Its defenders could pour boiling oil from spouts, shoot arrows through murder holes, and vanish behind steel doors as thick as trees. Inside its walls, only 1,500 soldiers stood ready. Among them were seasoned warriors of Almar, 100 Varnish Rangers, and the last free volunteers from the surrounding villages. All of them knew they were outnumbered. Commanding them was Lady Brenna, one of the few remaining veterans of Almar's early border campaigns. She was nearly 50, her hair more silver than black, and her voice sharp as a drawn sword. When asked if Greyhold could hold, she answered simply, "We have no other choice." The siege began on the 12th day of the frost moon. The first assault came before dawn, a probing attack by Dravik's forward units to test the walls. They came with ladders, ropes, and shields. They left behind piles of dead. Greyhold's defenders knew their fortress better than any map. They used hidden arrow loop. They set traps. They lit the cliffside torches and threw rocks from above. Kedra, watching from a high perch on the far ridge, said nothing. She studied the walls, measured the response time, counted the number of arrows fired. She was not trying to win in a day. She was trying to wear them down. For 20 days the siege wore on. Dravik built towers. Almar lit them on fire. Dravik dug tunnels. The Varnish collapsed them with countermines and smoke. Each night, the cliffs echoed with the sound of drums, war horns, and the howls of wounded men. But still, Greyhold stood. Inside the walls, food began to dwindle. Fires were kept small to save fuel. Bread was baked with bark flour. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Yet not one soldier deserted. Because they knew, behind them was nothing but open land. If Greyhold fell, so would the rest of the Western Valley. On the 21st day, Kedra unleashed her secret weapon. A new siege engine, massive, wheeled, and plated in iron. It was called the Fist. It moved slowly, creaking and groaning like a beast of myth. At its front was a battering ram carved from the wood of a sacred tree, reinforced with steel and fire-hardened. When it struck, the sound echoed like thunder. Boom, boom, boom. Each strike shook the gate of Greyhold. Each strike shattered stone and hope alike. Inside, Lady Brenna stood unmoved. She ordered her archers to target the wheels, her sappers to dig counterpits, and her mages, few though they were, to summon winds and fire from the upper towers. But even magic could not stop the Fist. It struck again, and again. And on the morning of the 24th day, the gates cracked. The final assault came on the 25th. Dravik's legions surged forward, infantry in tight formations, backed by archers and siege rams. The battlefield filled with smoke, ash, and screams. Ladders rose. The walls shook. The defenders fought hand to hand, blade to blade. Lady Brenna was everywhere, shouting orders, patching wounds, cutting down invaders with her father's sword. She bled from 3 wounds but refused to fall. When the gates finally splintered, She ordered a retreat to the inner keep. What followed was a battle not on walls, but in corridors. Every hall of Greyhold became a graveyard. Boiling oil poured from hidden grates. Fire traps burst from stone tiles. Spears thrust from walls that weren't walls. The fortress defended itself, even when its people could not. But the defenders were outnumbered. By nightfall, only 100 remained. Hydra entered the ruined courtyard personally, her boots crunching on bloodied stone. Her armor was dented, her sword black with soot. She found Lady Brenna atop the final stairwell, too weak to stand, but still gripping her sword. Hydra did not raise her blade. Instead, she knelt beside her. "You could have surrendered," she said. Brenna coughed blood. "We did." Hydra frowned. When we stood our ground. Then she died. Greyhold had fallen. Dravik's banners were raised over its towers. Its gates were sealed. Its walls, though broken, now guarded the Empire's advance. Hydra did not celebrate. She walked the battlefield in silence, ordering that the bodies of the defenders be buried with honor. She sent word to Renar. Greyhold has fallen. But it did not break. In Almar, the news spread like wildfire. The people mourned. Temples rang bells for 3 days. Children laid stones in piles for the dead. The name of Lady Brenna became legend overnight. But Prince Elric did not retreat. He called his generals. He studied the map. And he swore an oath before his war council. Greyhold did not fall in vain. We will retake it, or we will bury the enemy within its walls. The siege of Greyhold marked a turning point in the war. Dravik had shown its power, but also its cost. Almar had lost a fortress, but gained a martyr. And somewhere in the desert, under stars older than memory, the god king of Kemtar looked to the west and smiled. For the fifth fire was rising. And the world would soon be consumed. The fall of Greyhold sent ripples across the known world. Almar bled. Dravik roared. And the watchers from Kemtar continued their silent movements in the east. But war, like water, never flows in a single direction for long. While banners changed hands and cities fell, something unexpected began to stir, not from thrones or temples, but from the hearts of those who had nothing left to lose. Rebels, nomads, deserters turned patriot, and those forgotten by history. The tide, though slow, had begun to turn. In the shadow of Greyhold, where the blackened stones still smoked and ash swirled in the wind, a boy knelt beside the ruins. He was no soldier, no prince, just a stable hand named Tarn. He had hidden during the siege, buried beneath the grain cellar, surviving off moldy crust and melted snow. When he emerged, he saw bodies piled in the courtyards. He did not scream. He did not cry. He simply took a sword from the hand of a dead soldier and walked east. He was the first of many. In the northern hills, Almoran villagers who had once fled now picked up arms. Their homes had been burned, their children taken. And so, they fought not to win, but to make the enemy bleed. They struck from the forest. They raided Dravik's supply lines. They poisoned wells. They killed sentries in their sleep. The Dravik commanders called them savages. The people called them freedom fighters. And they called themselves simply, the Ashborn. In the port town of Cavan's Reach, Thalorian sailors returned in force. Queen Cerealis, the Stormblade, had remained silent since her early raids. But now, with Greyhold fallen and the river choked by Dravik garrisons, she sent 50 warships upriver. They struck like thunder, cutting off supply lines, destroying bridges, reclaiming trade routes long thought lost. Cerealis sent a single message to Elric. "You held the land. I'll take the water." And she did. But perhaps the greatest shift came not from sword or ship, but from the mountain city of Varn. After the victory at the Battle of the Canyons, the Varnish had returned home for the deep snows. But as spring approached, they returned in greater numbers. 10,000 strong. Led by Thera of Valn, they moved not as mercenaries, but as brothers and sisters in arms. They crossed back into Almar, singing mountain chants, their axes gleaming in the dawn. Elric met them at the river crossing, flanked by Almoran infantry and surviving archers from Solenwatch. He said nothing. He only raised his blade. And Thera, ever proud, gave him a nod. The tide had begun to turn. Hydra, deep within the Iron Citadel, read the reports in silence. Losses on the eastern ridges. River raids. Sabotage. And whispers. Whispers that the people of Dravik were beginning to question the war. She spoke with Varkal, the Emperor, in a private chamber. The war cannot be won by force alone, she said. We must break their will. Varkle leaned forward. Then break it. And so Kedra devised a plan. Not to win a battle, but to unmake a king. In the city of Renar, Prince Elric sat with his advisors. He was no longer the hopeful young envoy who had begged for peace across the river. His hair had darkened. His hands were calloused. He wore no crown, but he commanded every room he entered. He knew the war could not be won on defense. So he devised his own plan, not to take land, but to take hearts. He began sending messengers, not to kings, but to people. To the farmers near the front lines. To the orphans in the hills. To the wives of captured soldiers. He sent them grain. He sent them weapons. He sent them hope. And most importantly, he sent them a voice. Every town that stood against Dravik was not alone. Every fire they lit was part of something greater. And across the land, the people began to rise. The Ashborn led a daring raid into the heart of Dravik-occupied territory. They took the town of Velmar in a single night, freeing over 200 prisoners and setting fire to Dravik banners. One of those prisoners was Tarn, the stable boy from Greyhold. He had grown taller, stronger, quieter. He never gave speeches. But he never stopped fighting. Queen Cirilla struck again, this time, the naval port of Stonehook, long thought untouchable. Her sea guard used underwater charges to destroy the dockyards, crippling Dravik's river fleet for an entire season. Kedra, frustrated but impressed, muttered one word when she read the report. Stormblade. And from the desert, as silent as ever, Kemtar moved once more. Their warriors, now familiar with the terrain, struck at a Dravik caravan carrying salt, steel, and gold. They left behind a single sign. A sun drawn in ash. No one knew where they would strike next. And no one could stop them. Inside Almar, the people began to believe again. Old temples were rebuilt. Towns once lost were reclaimed. Songs once buried in grief were sung again, quietly at first, then louder. And among the soldiers, a name began to rise. Elric, the River Hawk. But now they called him something else. The Stone Prince. For though his hands bled and his eyes burned with weariness, he never wavered. Kedra responded in kind. She burned villages suspected of housing rebels. She enforced brutal discipline on her own troop. And she sent assassins into the heart of Almar, not to kill Elric but to discredit him. Twice they failed. The third time they nearly succeeded. Elric was ambushed on the road to Velwyn Keep. His escort slain. His horse shot. He was wounded, a deep cut along the ribs. But he survived. When he returned to Renar, bloody and pale, he stood before the city without speaking. He raised his sword. The people erupted. The Stone Prince had bled. And had not broken. The turning tide did not crash all at once. It rose slowly. In every whispered rebellion. In every torch lit in the hills. In every story passed from mother to son. The war was far from over. But it had changed. No longer a march for territory. Now a battle for souls. And one by one, those who had lost everything, began to fight for something. Not just revenge. But a future. As the war dragged into its fourth year, the battlefronts stretched thin. The valley was soaked in blood. The mountains groaned under the weight of armies. The river no longer flowed clean. But not all threats came from across borders. Some came from within. Whispers in the night. Knives behind closed doors. Secrets traded for gold. While armies clashed in open battle, a new war began in the dark. One fought not with swords and fire, but with poison, betrayal, and fear. This was the war of spies, of assassins, of secrets. And it would change everything. In the capital city of Renar, things were quiet on the surface. Merchants returned to the squares. Children played between alleys. The bells of the temple rang each morning. But behind the walls, within the inner chambers of government, a different world took shape. Reports flooded in, strange disappearances. Guards found dead with no wounds. Documents stolen. Letters forged. An informant caught whispering Dravik's war orders in the taverns. Elric summoned his spymaster, Varen Sill. A man known for his silence and memory sharper than steel. Someone, Elric said, is feeding them our breath before we speak it. Varen bowed. I will find the leak. But you must not trust anyone, even those who stand at your side. And so began the purge of the silent war. In the iron citadel of Dravik, Kedra received her own warnings. A courier was caught carrying a sealed scroll. Inside was a full list of Dravik supply routes, copied by someone within her own command. She questioned her captains. No one broke. But one thing was clear: Almar had spies. And worse, some of them were Dravik-born. Khedra ordered a cleansing of the officer corps. She implemented daily code changes, executed suspected informants, and sealed the war council chambers for 3 days straight. But every secret she buried seemed to sprout 2 more. Back in Renar, Varen Sil uncovered the source of the betrayal. It was not a noble. It was not a soldier. It was a clerk. A quiet man named Elric of Lance, who copied records in the Hall of Grain. He had never fought, never drawn a blade. But he had a sister, held hostage in the east by Dravik's agents. He confessed under candlelight. They said they'd kill her if I didn't. I just passed letters. I didn't know what was inside. Elric stood in silence. He did not rage. He did not sentence the man. Instead, he asked one question. Where is she now? Elric shook his head. They killed her. A month ago. Elric gave the man a sword. And let him choose his own end. The Shadow War continued. In the city of Havenmoor, 2 Almoran officers were poisoned by wine. In Varn, a courier carrying battle orders vanished. Only his boots were found, half buried in snow. In the eastern reaches of Kemtar, an ancient temple was looted, scrolls stolen. No one claimed responsibility. The lines between nations blurred. No uniform. No banner. Only knives in the dark. Even the mighty were not immune. Elric's closest advisor, General Idrin, his cousin and war brother, was ambushed in the mountains. He survived, but lost an eye. The attackers wore no insignia. They knew our positions, Idrin said. They knew where I would ride. Someone inside our walls told them. Elric doubled the guards. He moved his council meetings to different locations each day. He spoke in coded phrases, used decoy messengers, and sealed his letters with firewax. But still, information leaked. In Dravik, Khedra faced her own betrayal. Her second-in-command, General Sereth, was caught meeting with a man from Kemtar. Khedra did not kill him outright. She brought him to the gates of the Iron Citadel, and asked why. Sereth, pale and shaking, said only, "You don't see what's coming." Khedra drew her sword and ended him with a single stroke. She buried him without honor. But his words remained. Far in the south, a group of mercenaries called the Black Flame appeared. They took no side. They killed for coin. They infiltrated cities, set fires, sabotaged for both Almar and Dravik, whichever paid more. No one knew their leader. No one ever saw their faces. Varen Sil tried to track them. He found only a letter nailed to a post. We serve chaos, and chaos serves itself. In Kemtar, the high priest Nariman warned the God King of imbalance. There is too much shadow, he said. Too much silence. The war consumes not just men, but meaning. The God King, unmoved for years, finally spoke. Then we must reveal the flame. What that meant, no one yet understood. But Kemtar's agents began leaving behind a new symbol, a sun pierced by a dagger. The fifth fire had stirred. Back in Renar, Elric faced his most difficult decision yet. Varen Sil discovered a plot, one reaching high into the court. 3 nobles, long trusted, had been bribed by Dravik to delay military funding. They had cost Almar time, lives, and perhaps battles. Elric summoned them to his war chamber. They begged. They swore innocence. But the evidence was clear. Elric ordered their execution, not in secret, but in public before the court. It was swift. 3 strikes. 3 deaths. And from that day on, betrayal carried only one price. But not all shadows were cruel. Some worked for light. A Kemtari scribe named Zahir defected to Almar, bringing with him the missing pieces of the Scroll of Ashes, prophecy long hidden. It spoke of a reckoning to come. A war not just of empires, but of endings. One line stood out. The blade born of shadow shall split the 5th fire. Varen translated it. Elric memorized it, and said, then we must be ready. The war in the dark would never be won. Not fully. There would always be whispers. There would always be fear. But in facing it, Elric had become more than a soldier. He had become a guardian, not just of a kingdom, but of trust itself. And as spring bloomed once more across the scorched valley, the light began to return. Slowly. Flickering. But defiantly. Because no matter how deep the shadow, someone, somewhere, would always light the flame. As the 5th winter of the war approached, the land groaned beneath the weight of its wounds. The river valley, once the heart of peace and prosperity, was now a frozen graveyard of ambitions. Crops failed, roads vanished beneath snowdrift, and even the soldiers grew quiet. It was the coldest winter in 100 years. But even in the silence of ice and wind, alliances stirred. Across the valley, two nations, once enemies, once strangers, began to whisper the impossible. A pact. Not of peace, but of survival. The kingdom of Almar was starving. The war had drained its resources. The fields near the river were long lost, held by Dravik. The mountain passes, once protected by Greyhold, were now too dangerous for caravans. And the southern trade roads, battered by skirmishes and ambushes, lay buried beneath snow. Prince Elric stood before his council, pale and thin, a scar still fresh on his ribs from the failed assassination months earlier. "We will not last the winter," said his steward. "Our grain stores are low. Salt is gone. And half our horses are dead." The nobles argued. Some demanded a retreat to the highlands. Others suggested surrender, just to feed the people. But Elric did not waver. "No one surrenders," he said. "Not while I still breathe." And then he said something no one expected. "Send word to the Loria." Across the frozen bay, Queen Cerilis sat in her sea-facing fortress. The Stormblade, ruler of waves, wielder of silence. She had watched the war consume the land like a fire without fuel. Her ships were trapped in ice. Her sailors restless. Her ports bare. The Loria had not suffered like Almar, but it had not prospered either. Then the raven came. It carried a sealed scroll with 3 words. "Meet me. Alone. A." Cerilis smiled. And sailed through the ice. They met on neutral ground, the island of Vyre, a barren speck of stone between the river delta and the northern coast. A place once used by smugglers, now watched by hawks. Elric came with no guards. Cerilis brought only her first mate, an old woman named Neva. They stood in silence beside a frozen fire pit, the wind howling like wolves around them. "I thought you were dead," Cerilis said. "I was," Elric answered. "In many ways." They did not speak of politics. Not yet. Instead, they spoke of what was left. What had been lost. What could still be saved. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end, Cerilis placed her hand upon Elric's shoulder and said, "Very well. Let the ice bind us." And thus was born the Winter Pact. Almar and the Loria, bound not by loyalty, but necessity. The terms were simple. The Loria would supply food from its coastal stores. Salt fish, dried kelp, hard bread. Almar would supply soldiers, to defend the docks and ports from Dravik's coming spring assault. Together, they would survive the winter. Together, they would plan the counterstrike. Word spread quickly. At first, many in Almar opposed the pact. "They are pirates," one noble spat. "Untrustworthy. Self-serving." "They are alive," Elric replied. "And that is more than I can say for many." In the Loria, there was hesitation too. "Why should we save landwalkers?" a sailor muttered. "Because they will bleed for us when the thaw comes," Cerilis said. "And when this war ends, we will write its ending together." The pact held. Barely. Storms struck the Thalorian fleet as it moved upriver, freezing half its supply barges in the estuary. In the mountains, rebels from the eastern hill tribes attacked a joint convoy, burning supplies and killing 20. But the goods arrived. Bread, salt, fish. Not enough to feast, but enough to endure. Elric stood in the city square of Renar as the first cartloads rolled in. He did not give a speech. He only stepped aside and let the children eat first. That moment, quiet, small, became legend. But the pact came at a price. Dravik responded swiftly. Hydra, though slowed by the Shadow War and mounting pressure from Varkle, dispatched a winter force, hardened veterans, dressed in black furs, known as the Frost Fangs. They struck the river ports at night, burned the docks, poisoned the stores, slaughtered anyone who bore the Thalorian seal. Cerilis was furious. She dispatched her personal guard to hunt the Frostfangs down. One by one, they disappeared into the ice. None returned. And in the deep south, a new threat stirred. Kemtar, ever watchful, sent emissaries to both sides. But their message was unclear. They spoke of omens. Of fire beneath ice. Of a shadow that crossed the moon. No one knew what they meant. But the high priest Nariman spoke a single phrase, recorded by the Almoran scribes who met him. "When the river thaws, the 5th fire shall walk." Elric pondered those words late into the night. He did not yet understand. But he felt them in his bones. In the final month of winter, as the snow turned to slush and the ice began to crack, a single rider arrived in Renar. He was half dead, frostbitten, bleeding from the chest. He carried no banner, but in his hand a sword. Not forged by Almar or Dravik. A sword of black glass, warm to the touch. He died before he could speak. But carved into the blade were ancient runes. Not of any known language. Not even Chemtari. Elric kept it locked in a vault beneath the citadel. Unseen. Untouched. Waiting. The winter pact held. Barely. But it held. And when the snows melted and the first thaw came, the people emerged not with weakness, but with will. The land had endured. And now it would rise. The tide would turn again. But this time not just by men. Something else had awakened. And the spring would bring more than flowers. It would bring reckoning. When the fifth spring dawned on the war-torn valley, the snow melted slowly, revealing not just the scars of battle, but something else, something ancient, something waiting. The rivers swelled. The roads cleared. Armies prepared to march once again. But before banners were raised and swords drawn anew, a whisper rose in the south. Of a child. A child who walked alone from the desert. A child who did not speak. A child holding a sword that burned without fire. They called him the Flameborn. And with him, the war would change forever. He was first seen near the edge of the dunes, where the sands met the scorched grasslands once belonging to the eastern tribes. A caravan spotted him, barefoot, cloaked in rags, walking straight into the wind. He bore no markings. No name. Only the sword. It pulsed faintly in his hand. Not with heat, but with something deeper, like the heartbeat of the earth. The caravan fled. Some thought him a spirit. Others a weapon. But the child continued walking. Straight toward the heart of the war. Word spread like fire. In Chemtar, the priests lit 1,000 braziers in the temple of the first flame. Nariman himself stood before the sacred pyre and whispered, "The fifth fire walks." In Renar, Elric received news from 3 sources. A merchant, a Thalorian scout, and a refugee from the dunes, all speaking of the same child. Each described the sword differently. One said it glowed like the sun. Another, that it whispered in an unknown tongue. The third, that it was calling for someone. Elric summoned his scholars. They found no record of such a blade. Not in Almar. Not in Dravik. Not even in the Chemtari archives. But the name from prophecy resurfaced. The Flameborn. Hydra too received reports. She did not believe them. A child? Alone? Dravik's war council scoffed. Another myth, said one general. Desperation dressed in story. But Kydra said nothing. She had seen enough strange things in 5 years of war to know one truth. Where there is smoke, there is always something burning. The child reached the ruins of Velwyn Keep, destroyed years earlier in the first push from Dravik. He did not camp. He did not eat. He simply stood atop the broken tower and raised his sword to the sky. That night, lightning struck the far cliff. A fire burned where no fire should have burned. And yet, it left the trees unmarked. The next day, he was gone. But the stories remained. A week later, a small town in the western hills was attacked by rogue Dravik soldiers, deserters turned raiders. They burned homes. They took hostages. And then, without warning, the child appeared. The raiders laughed. Then the sword was drawn. They stopped laughing. Witnesses said the blade moved without touching. That when it passed through air, the air split like fabric. And when the fighting was over, 20 men lay dead. The child had not spoken. He simply vanished again, walking east. Elric sent riders. But they could not find him. He moved too quickly. Or perhaps the world simply let him pass. Finally, Elric sent Lysar, the young scribe who once met the high priest of Chemtar. She was calm, curious, and unafraid. She found the boy 3 days later in an abandoned orchard, sitting beneath a tree. The sword rested beside him. He did not speak. But he watched her. And when she asked, "Who are you?" he blinked once. Then pointed upward. At the sun. She returned with a message. "He is not ours," she said. "But he is not theirs either." "What is he?" Elric asked. "I think," she said, "he is war made flesh." In Dravik, Kydra had begun preparing for a final offensive, to push Almar back into the mountains once and for all. But the sightings of the child changed things. Fear crept in. Soldiers refused to march through towns he had visited. They whispered stories. That he walked through fire. That no arrow could touch him. That he was the God King's judgment. Khidra increased discipline. Executed 2 for spreading panic. But the stories kept growing. Because they weren't stories anymore. Too many had seen him. And all described the same thing. Silence. And a sword that hummed like thunder beneath water. Then came the moment that changed everything. The child walked into a battlefield. It was not a major one, just a skirmish between Almoran scouts and a Dravik raiding party near the cliffs of Varn's Edge. Neither side expected a third party. He appeared between them, calm, barefoot, sword in hand. Both sides stopped. He raised the blade. Not to strike, but to plant it. He drove it into the earth. And the earth cracked. A ring of heat burst outward, not fire, not destruction, but pressure. Like a wave of stillness. Every soldier dropped to their knees. And then he walked away, leaving the blade in the soil. When they approached it, it was gone. Melted. Or perhaps taken back by the earth. But the mark it left behind never healed. Not even now. After that, no one doubted. The Flameborn was real. And he had chosen no side. Only balance. In the weeks that followed, desert winds reached farther into the valley. The stars shifted in strange patterns. A lunar eclipse appeared weeks earlier than predicted. And in the temples of Kemtar, the sacred fires burned blue. Naramund declared, "The gate is open." No one knew what he meant. But even Khidra listened. Elric, weary and torn, stood once more atop the walls of Renar. He watched as rain fell upon scorched stone. He did not know what the child was. But he knew what he meant. The war had entered a new phase. One not written by kings or swords. But by something older. And deeper. The child had come not to end the war. But to remind the world what it had forgotten. The cost. The Flameborn still walks. Alone. Silent. His path unknown. But wherever he passes, men stop fighting. If only for a moment. Because something greater is watching. And the fire that walks beside him still burns. 5 years of war. 5 winters. 5 flames. And now the end. Not written in prophecy. Not decided in a single battle. But in 100 choices. By soldiers who had lost everything. By kings who never wanted thrones. And by a silent child who carried the memory of fire. This is how the ancient war ended. Not with glory. But with a choice. The final march began in silence. Khidra's army, exhausted but vast, crossed the Diran for the last time. Not as invaders, but as survivors. Their armor dented. Their standards tattered. Their faces unreadable. Ahead of them lay the plains of Ardhan, the last wide stretch between them and Renar. Almar had gathered its full strength there. Elric stood among them, no longer prince, not even king. Just a man. Wearing his father's cloak. Holding no crown. Only resolve. Behind him stood Varnish warriors. Thalorian sailors turned swordsmen. Desert-born scouts from Kemtar. And the Ashborn, rebels, villagers, orphans, ghosts. They stood side by side. Because they had nowhere left to run. And because they believed not in victory. But in each other. The two armies met at sunrise. They did not charge. They did not roar. They simply waited. Until a single figure walked between them. The child. The Flameborn. He stood between spears and shields, barefoot, unchanged. And this time, he spoke. Just one word. Enough. Something happened then. A sound like thunder cracking through stone. The sky darkened. And the wind stopped. Everyone, every soldier, every horse, every crow in the sky, froze. And they saw. They saw the war as it truly was. Not banners. Not borders. But mothers burying sons. Fathers forgetting laughter. Fields turned to ash. Towers collapse. Children learning fear before speech. And they wept. Some dropped their weapons. Some dropped to their knees. Some stood motionless, as if waking from a long and terrible dream. Khidra stepped forward. She removed her helmet. Her hair white with ash and frost. She looked at Elric. And nodded. "I've had enough," she said. And dropped her sword. Others followed. Not all. But enough. And so the war ended. Not with treaties. Not with kings. But with people too tired to hate. Too broken to fight. Too human to continue. In the weeks that followed, the armies disbanded. No side declared victory. There was nothing to celebrate. The river ran clean again, slowly. The fields were replanted. The children laughed again, softly. And ruins became homes. Not all wounds healed. Some never will. But the fire faded. And peace, fragile, flawed, but real, returned. Hydra returned to Dravik. She did not take command. She retired to the high cliff, built a small home of stone and silence. Some say she still walks the ridges at dawn, watching the valley. A guardian without a war. Elric remained in Renar. He refused a crown. He rebuilt the city wall by wall, hand by hand. He married no one. He ruled by counsel. And when people asked who he was, he answered only, "I'm the man who chose to stay." The Flameborn? No one knows. Some say he vanished into the desert. Others say he turned to smoke the moment peace was made. But those who saw him never forgot. And every generation since has told the story of the child who ended war. Not with fire, but with a word. They rebuilt Greyhold. Not as a fortress, but as a place of remembrance. No banners hang there. Only stones. Each with a name. Soldier or peasant. King or thief. All equal. All fallen. All remembered. This was the ancient war. Born of drought. Fueled by pride. Ended by grief. And shaped not by glory, but by pain. By silence. By those who chose to lay down the sword when no one else would. The past is ash. But the oath remains. Never again. Never again. Never again.